Hey GC fam, it's so good to be back with you guys. I loved having our study through Colossians these past couple weeks, and then we took a week off last week just to do an evangelism night, and we talked about how we can holistically share the gospel with our unbelieving friends and family. But I am really excited that we're going to be getting back into the Bible for the next 4 weeks, and we're going to be looking at the Old Testament book of Haggai. Now, if you've never heard of the book of Haggai, or if you don't know where it's at in the Bible, no worries. That's the case for a lot of people. But this book actually is pretty important for us today because as we're transitioning out of 2020, a horrible year, a hard year, and also trying to just figure out how we get back to normal, the book of Haggai actually has a really good reminder for us. The book of Haggai was meant to remind the people of God who had just returned out of exile, so they had transitioned out of a pretty horrible time. It was meant to remind them of the calling that they had on their life. More specifically, Haggai the prophet wanted to remind the people of their call to rebuild the temple or to build God's house. But if we're really going to want the book of Haggai to hit us the way we need to, we need to do a little bit of history, so bear with me on this. The reason why this call is so important is because the temple was really important. See, the temple in the Old Testament was the place where God dwelt with his people and where from there his glory would then be sent out into the nations and into all the world. But what many people don't know is that the Solomon's temple, the temple that Haggai wants rebuilt in the Old Testament, that actually wasn't the first temple. Many scholars believe that the Solomon's temple was actually patterned after the Garden of Eden. See, we go all the way back to Garden of Eden, we see that God's plan was there. See, Eden functioned like this garden temple where God dwelt with his people, Adam and Eve, where they got to see his glory. And it was from there that his glory would go out to fill all of creation. But we read in Genesis 3 that Adam and Eve failed to meet God's standard. They sinned and the world was broken, and then all of humanity was kicked out of God's presence in the garden. But even though in the middle of all that tragedy, God promises that he will reverse the curse and that his plan to dwell with his people and for his glory to fill the earth will come to fruition. So we fast forward a bit, we read in the rest of the Old Testament, we see that God picks this guy named Abraham, and it's through his family Israel that the temple was built in Jerusalem. You know, it's the place where God dwells with his people through worship and the sacrificial system, and it's from there that the nations hear about the saving glory of God. In a way, it becomes a taste of the day when God will fully dwell with his people and when his glory will fill the earth and restore this broken creation. But just like Adam and Eve, Israel turns from God in sin, and in 586 BC, through the Babylonian conquest, God's people are exiled out of the land, and tragically the temple is destroyed. So no worship, no nations hearing about the glory of God. But remember, God promises that his plan will come to fruition. So then we see that 70 years later, Babylon is captured or conquered by Persia, and the new king allows God's people to come back into the land. And part of the restoration process is their call from God to rebuild the temple. And they start off well. They lay the foundation, they build up the city. But 18 years later, they've completely abandoned construction on the temple, and the temple lies in ruins. But what we need to see is that by the people abandoning the construction of the temple, what they've really done is they've abandoned God and his plan. So when we read the book of Haggai, what we're seeing is Haggai's not just calling them back to a construction project. What he's actually doing is he's calling them back to God and for them to take part of his plan to dwell with his people and for his glory to fill the earth. And that call is for us as God's people. In the midst of all this craziness, we need to be reminded that we are called to build God's house. We're called to take part of his plan to dwell with his people and for his glory to fill the earth. So the first passage we're going to study today is Haggai chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. And the focus there is actually on time. So our big idea is now is the time to build God's house. Now is the time to build God's house. And the main way we actually embrace this reality, embrace the fact that now is the time to build God's house, is by doing two things. Considering our priorities and considering our response. So let's just break those two up. So start with the priorities one. Let's consider our priorities and read that in verses 1 through 6. So let's just read that real quickly. In the second year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Thus says the Lord of hosts, these people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Then the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, while this house lies in ruins? Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages does so to put them into a bag with holes. So in these first couple of verses, I think the phrase we need to focus on is that phrase, consider your ways. See, in these first verses, what Haggai is trying to do, he's trying to get the people to consider what they've been doing. See, the prevailing thought that's going on in the restoration process right now in the community is that now is not the right time to rebuild God's house. And many scholars believe that there's a couple reasons why the people would have believed that. Maybe it was because of the international tension. There were other people groups in the land, and they didn't like the fact that Israel was coming back into the land, so they wanted to make life hard for them. Economic struggle. The restoration process took place during an economic recession, so the people couldn't grow crops to sell or to eat. They couldn't provide the basic necessities for their family. Or even it was political chaos. There was a pagan king in office and in power, and many people could have believed that surely now was not the time to rebuild the temple while there was a pagan king in power. But no matter what the reason was, Haggai uses that phrase, consider your ways, to just tear apart that main idea that now is not the time to rebuild God's house. He tells them, you're saying there's not enough time, resources, or money to rebuild the temple, but there is enough time, resources, or money to rebuild your own house, to build up your own paneled houses. See, Haggai's not condemning the people for taking care of their family. He's condemning them for doing that at the expense of obedience to God. See, delayed obedience was the real problem in these verses. And I think we all struggle with that. How many of us have said the same thing? I'll get serious with God. I'll get serious about Sunday morning worship or gathered worship. I'll get serious about community group when finances are better, when my job's better, when my kids are out of school, when the sports schedule has mixed up, when my kids are out of the house. But what we all need to see is that delayed obedience stems from a dark lie that we all believe, that God's not good. That's the lie that Adam and Eve believed in the garden. And it's what caused them to turn to the idols of self and believe that their own human wisdom and desires could lead to human flourishing. And we do the same thing. For the past thousands of years, we have delayed obedience to God because we think that God does not have our best interests in mind. But here's the good news, is that God's plan to dwell with His people and for the earth to be filled with His glory is what creation's been crying out for since the Garden of Eden. See, these things are the blessings of the gospel, that even though sin has broken the world and separated us from God, because of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, we're made right with God. And we get to look forward to the day when His glory does fill the earth and restore this broken creation. And it's people who've been enveloped with that, who've been prioritizing that have been the catalyst for human flourishing. It's those types of people who have prioritized God's plan, the building of God's house, who fought for the abolition of slavery, for education for all, for hospitals and for orphanages. See, God's plan is the best thing for you, for your family, and for this world. We need to consider our priorities when it comes to the building up of God's house. So that's the first way. Let's look at the second way. The second way we embrace the fact that now is the time to build God's house. It's by just considering our response. And we see that in verses 7 through 11. So let's read those real quick. Verse 7. Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house, and I may take pleasure in it, and that I may be glorified, says the Lord. You looked for much, and behold, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why? Declares the Lord of hosts. Because of my house that lies in ruins. While each of you busies himself with his own house, therefore, the heavens above you have withheld the dew, and the earth has withheld its produce. And I have called for a drought on the land and the hills, on the grain, the new wine, the oil, on what the ground brings forth, on man and beast, and on all their labors. So in this part, we see that phrase again, consider your ways. And what Haggai is doing there is that he's trying to get them to see the proper response that we all should have to God's call. And he gives them two options. He goes, here's the correct response and its consequences, and here's the wrong response with its consequences. In verses 7 and 8, we see the correct response is to go up into the hills and collect supplies. Basically, get back to work on the temple. And the result will be that God is glorified. See, what that means is that the people collecting these supplies and doing the construction, they were doing things of eternal significance because they were building up the means by which God would dwell with his people and the world would come to know about his glory. But the incorrect response was the thing that they were already doing. He says they've been busying themselves with their houses, but it's amounted to little. See, what would happen is that their idolatry of their own houses, of their comfort, had led to them putting their hope in things that could be taken away by something as common as a drought in the Middle East. I know 2020 was hard, but I think one of the blessings that came from it is that God used it to show us that the things that we tend to put all of our time, money, and effort into can all be blown away like that. But the real issue that's being spoken about here is actually the issue of glory. Verse 8 talks about that God would be glorified by the building up of the temple. See, while we pour out all ourselves into our vocations, our school, our achievements, our own houses, what we're really doing is we're just fighting for glory. We want our own glory to be seen and our own glory to be sent out into all the earth. That's exactly what happened in Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve. The lie wasn't just that God wasn't good, but that they could be God, that they could have the glory. And that's such a deep issue inside of us that behavioral modification, that just changing up our routine, won't change the fact that by nature we are all glory thieves. We want the glory that only belongs to God. But the good news of our passage is that the temple points us to something greater. It points us to Jesus. He put on flesh as God and dwelt among us. He templed among us and he proclaimed the saving glory to the world. And it's through his life, death, and resurrection that we're transformed from glory thieves into ambassadors for his glory. And this group of redeemed sinners called the church are now the means by which God's glory is seen and sent out into the world. Your local group, your local church is a means by which God's glory is seen and sent out into the world through worship, through the proclamation of the gospel, and through missions. So the most practical way we build God's house, that call on our life, is actually just serving in the local church. When you serve in your church through kids ministry, through giving, through cleaning, through greeting, through becoming part of a church plan like what we're talking about, you're building up God's house. You're not doing anything that's wasting your time because you are building up the means by which God's glory is seen and sent out into the world. When you serve in our community group, you are building up God's house. What I hope for you guys to see in this whole, as we begin through the book of Haggai, is that God has called us to something glorious. He's made us ambassadors for his glory. And I just can't wait to talk more and more with you guys about that. I'll see you guys on Wednesday, GC fam. Love you guys.